When Zara Chun wakes up wrapped in silk sheets worth more than her annual salary, cradled in arms that belong to one of Seoul's most dangerous men, she thinks it has to be a dream. But the lingering taste of chloroform on her tongue and the ache in her ribs remind her that nightmares can have the strangest endings. 3 days ago, she was a social worker earning barely enough to survive. Now she's under the protection of Kim Tae-hyun, a man whose name alone makes hardened criminals cross the street. At 24, Zara had dedicated her life to saving others, working endless hours at the community center in Seoul's roughest district. She helped immigrant families navigate bureaucracy, connected struggling mothers to resources, fought for children caught in impossible situations. Her apartment was a cramped studio with peeling paint and a temperamental radiator, but it was hers. She spoke fluent Korean after 6 years in the country, her natural hair usually pulled back in practical braids, her warm brown eyes always searching for the next person who needed help. She was the kind of woman who gave her last 10,000 won to buy formula for a hungry baby, who stayed late every night because someone might need her. She was also the kind of woman that human trafficking rings noticed. The silk sheets felt impossibly soft against her skin as consciousness slowly returned. Zara's eyes opened to unfamiliar ceiling moldings, ornate and expensive, nothing like the water stains she was used to seeing above her bed. The room was massive, larger than her entire apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased a view of Seoul that belonged in magazines. Everything was cream and gold, pristine and clearly expensive. The bed alone probably cost more than she made in 5 years. Her body felt heavy, disconnected, like she was swimming through thick honey. Memories flickered in broken pieces. Walking home from the community center after another 16-hour day. The feeling of being followed. Footsteps matching her pace. The van that pulled up beside her. Strong hands. A chemical smell. Darkness swallowing her whole. But there was something else. A voice, deep and controlled, speaking rapid Korean into a phone. The sound of gunfire, distant but unmistakable. Arms lifting her when she thought she was going to die. Carrying her with surprising gentleness. A man's voice saying her name, telling her she was safe, that no one would hurt her again. Zara tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Her ribs screamed in protest, and her head felt like it was filled with cotton. She was wearing clothes that weren't hers, a soft cashmere sweater and silk pants that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Her own clothes, the practical black slacks and worn cardigan she'd put on for work 3 days ago, were nowhere to be seen. Have you ever woken up somewhere completely unfamiliar, wondering if your life just took a turn you never saw coming? That feeling of everything shifting, like the ground beneath your feet, isn't quite solid anymore. Where are you watching from tonight? And have you ever had a moment that changed everything in ways you couldn't have imagined? The door opened with barely a whisper, and Zara's entire body went rigid with fear. But the man who entered wasn't one of her kidnappers. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that fit like it had been made specifically for his frame. His features were sharp, almost sculpted, with dark hair swept back and darker eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He moved with controlled precision, each step deliberate, carrying a small medical kit in one hand and a glass of water in the other. This was Kim Tae-hyun, though she didn't know his name yet. What she could sense immediately was power, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. He was probably in his late 30s, Korean, with the bearing of a man accustomed to absolute authority. His suit was custom, his shoes Italian leather, his watch worth more than most people's cars. But it was his presence that filled the room, a weight of controlled intensity that made the expansive space feel intimate and somehow dangerous. "You're awake," he said, his English perfect though accented with the cultured tones of someone educated abroad. His voice was exactly what she remembered from her half-conscious state, deep and reassuring despite the circumstances. "You've been unconscious for 2 days." 2 days. Zara's mind reeled. "I need to go home," she said, trying again to sit up and failing. "People will be looking for me. My job, the families I help." He set the medical kit on the nightstand and pulled a chair closer to the bed, settling into it with fluid grace. "No one is looking for you," he said matter-of-factly. As far as official records show, Zara Chun took emergency leave for a family crisis. "Your supervisor received a very convincing call from your cousin in Los Angeles." The casual way he said it, like manufacturing an entire false story was nothing unusual, made her stomach clench with fear. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Someone who handles problems," Taehyun replied, opening the medical kit with steady hands. "The men who took you had plans for you. Unpleasant plans. They were part of a trafficking ring that targets social workers, aid workers, women who work alone and care too much to be properly careful. You were going to be sold." The words hit her like physical blows. Sold. The reality of what had almost happened to her, what was still happening to other women right now, made her entire body start shaking. "Why did you help me?" she asked. "You don't even know me." Taehyun's dark eyes met hers, and for a moment something almost vulnerable flickered across his controlled features. "Let's just say I have experience with men who hurt women, and I have resources to make sure they stop permanently." He reached for her wrist, checking her pulse with surprisingly gentle fingers. "Your kidnappers gave you a significant dose of chloroform and some other chemicals. You're going to feel disoriented for another day or two. But you're safe now." Safe. The word seemed impossible given the circumstances. She was in a stranger's house, a powerful and clearly dangerous stranger, wearing clothes he'd put on her while she was unconscious. But when she looked at his face, she realized she did feel safe. Confused, overwhelmed, completely out of her depth, but not afraid of him. The penthouse around them screamed wealth and power. Through the massive windows, Seoul spread out below like a jeweled carpet. The furniture was minimalist but clearly expensive, everything in shades of cream and charcoal with touches of gold. Original artwork hung on the walls, and the rugs looked hand-woven and priceless. This was a man who commanded resources that were almost incomprehensible to someone like her. "I want to see a doctor," she said finally. "A real doctor, not connected to whatever this is." Taehyun nodded as if he'd expected the request. "Dr. Park will be here within the hour. She's one of Seoul's top physicians, and she has a very generous retainer that ensures her discretion. But I can tell you that apart from dehydration and some bruising, you're physically fine. You were very lucky." "Lucky?" Zara almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "Lucky to be kidnapped. Lucky to wake up in a stranger's penthouse. Lucky to be dependent on someone who spoke about making people stop permanently like he was discussing the weather. But she was alive when she should have been dead or worse. That had to count for something." The medical examination confirmed what Taehyun had already told her. Dr. Park, a composed woman in her 50s, was thorough and professional, asking no questions about the circumstances that had brought her patient to this luxurious penthouse. Dehydration, mild concussion, bruising on her ribs and wrists from restraints, but nothing serious. Nothing permanent. After Dr. Park left with a prescription for rest and plenty of fluids, Zara found herself alone with her mysterious savior again. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting everything in golden light that made the whole situation feel even more surreal. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you rest," he replied simply. "Tomorrow we can discuss more practical matters." "What practical matters?" Taehyun was quiet for a long moment, standing at the window with his hands clasped behind his back. "The trafficking ring that took you was part of a larger operation. Taking you was just business to them, but eliminating them was personal to me. That kind of action creates complications." "Complications?" "Other organizations will want to know why I moved against the Park Syndicate. Some will assume you have information, that you're valuable to me. Others will simply want revenge. Either way, Miss Chun, returning to your old life is no longer a safe option." The words settled over her like ice water. She couldn't go home. Couldn't go back to her work, her life, her tiny apartment with the peeling paint. Everything she'd built in 6 years in Seoul was gone, erased by 3 days of unconsciousness and one man's decision to save her life. "So what are you saying?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. "I'm saying that your safety and my business interests are now connected whether we like it or not. And I'm very good at protecting what's mine." The possessive language should have frightened her. But looking at Kim Taehyun, seeing the controlled intensity in his dark eyes, and the way he carried himself like violence was always an option, but never a first choice, Zara realized that being his might be the only way to survive what she'd unwittingly become part of. Tomorrow, she thought, she would ask about practical matters. Tonight, she would try to accept that her life had been completely rewritten while she slept. and that waking up in silk sheets in a dangerous man's penthouse might be the closest thing to a happy ending that someone like her could hope for. The dream was over, but maybe reality would be better than anything she could have imagined. The next morning brought clarity that Zara wasn't sure she wanted. Taehyun appeared at her door carrying a breakfast tray that looked like it belonged in a five-star hotel, perfectly arranged with fresh fruit, warm pastries, and coffee that smelled better than anything she'd ever made in her tiny kitchen. He moved through the space with the confidence of someone completely comfortable with wealth, setting the tray on the bedside table before settling into the chair he'd occupied the day before. "You worked late Tuesday night," he said without preamble, as if continuing a conversation they'd been having. "The community center was officially closed, but you stayed to finish intake paperwork for the Kim family. 3 children, mother doesn't speak Korean well, father working 3 jobs to keep them housed." Zara's fork froze halfway to her mouth. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I make it my business to know about people who matter," Taehyun replied calmly. "You left the building at 11:47 p.m. You took the subway toward your apartment, but you were being followed from the moment you stepped onto the platform. 3 men, professionals, who'd been watching the community center for weeks." The food turned to ash in her mouth as the memories started clicking into place. She had felt watched lately, that prickling sensation between her shoulder blades when she walked home alone. She dismissed it as paranoia, the natural caution of a woman living alone in a city that could be dangerous after dark. "They followed you to your apartment building, waited until you were in the elevator, then moved. The plan was clean, professional. Take you, transport you to a processing facility outside the city, then sell you to buyers who specifically requested social workers. Women with language skills, education, experience helping others. You would have disappeared completely." Zara's hands started shaking, the coffee cup rattling against its saucer. "How do you know all this?" "Because I was there," Taehyun said simply. "I've been tracking this particular trafficking ring for months. They made the mistake of targeting someone under my protection, but you didn't even know me then." His dark eyes held hers steadily. "I've known about you for quite some time, Miss Chun. A social worker who gives her own money to buy food for hungry children, who stays past midnight helping families she'll never see again, who's built a reputation in Itaewon for being the only aid worker who actually keeps her promises. You think that kind of dedication goes unnoticed?" The way he said it, matter of fact and somehow admiring, made heat rise in her cheeks. She wasn't used to being seen so clearly, to having her work acknowledged by anyone, let alone someone like him. Most people saw social work as thankless drudgery, not something worthy of protection from mysterious powerful men. "What exactly happened that night?" she asked. Taehyun leaned back in his chair, his expensive suit immaculate despite the early hour. His appearance was even more striking in the morning light streaming through the penthouse windows. He was probably 6 feet tall, with the kind of lean build that suggested both strength and speed. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his skin clear and unmarked except for a thin scar along his left temple that spoke of violence survived. His hands were long-fingered and graceful, but she noticed calluses that suggested he was no stranger to physical work. "The kidnapping went exactly as planned until I intervened," he continued. "They had you sedated and loaded into their transport vehicle when my people moved. The entire operation was eliminated within 6 minutes. You were unconscious but unharmed." "Eliminated." The casual way he said it sent ice through her veins. "You killed them. The trafficking ring no longer exists," he confirmed without emotion. "The processing facility has been destroyed. The buyers they were supplying have been contacted and informed that their supply chain is permanently severed. The problem has been solved comprehensively." Zara stared at him, trying to reconcile this calm recitation of wholesale murder with the man who'd brought her breakfast and checked her pulse with gentle fingers. "How many people?" "Does it matter?" Taehyun asked quietly. "They were going to sell you like livestock. They were going to do the same thing to dozens of other women. Some problems can't be solved with social programs and good intentions, Miss Chin. Some problems require more direct solutions." The moral weight of it settled over her like a heavy blanket. Men were dead because of her, because this dangerous stranger had decided she was worth saving. But those same men would have destroyed her life and countless others if they'd been allowed to continue operating. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why did you decide I was worth all this trouble?" Instead of answering immediately, Taehyun stood, and moved to a small table near the window. When he returned, he was carrying a leather wallet, expensive and heavy-looking. He set it on the bed beside her breakfast tray, close enough that she could see the edges of bills protruding from its folds. "This was dropped outside the community center last week," he said. "A businessman who'd been drinking too much, careless with his belongings. $50,000 US, enough to solve most of your financial problems permanently. You found it, spent an hour trying to track down the owner through credit cards and identification, then turned it in to the police completely untouched." Zara's cheeks burned. "You were watching me. I was evaluating you," he corrected. "That wallet was a test. Most people would have taken at least some of the money. You didn't even consider it a possibility." She looked at the wallet, still sitting within easy reach, and felt a familiar surge of principle-based stubbornness. Money that didn't belong to her would never be money she could use, no matter how desperately she needed it. The idea of theft, even from someone who clearly had enough to spare, made her physically sick. "Character is rare in this world," Taehyun continued, watching her face. "Integrity that can't be bought or bent is rarer still. You continue to surprise me, Miss Chin." The approval in his voice did something warm and confusing to her chest. She wasn't used to being valued for her principles instead of criticized for her impracticality. Her co-workers often told her she was too idealistic, too willing to exhaust herself for people who would never be able to repay her kindness. His phone buzzed, and Taehyun glanced at it before answering in rapid Korean. Zara's language skills let her follow most of the conversation, and what she heard made her blood run cold. He was discussing security arrangements with someone, mentioning sweep patterns and guard rotations like they were completely normal parts of daily life. Then the conversation shifted to what sounded like business matters, and she heard numbers that suggested financial operations on a scale she couldn't fully comprehend. "Yes, make sure the permits are expedited," he was saying. "I want the community center expansion completed within 2 months. Full funding, no questions asked. And increase the scholarship fund by another 2 million. There are more families that need help." He ended the call and returned his attention to her, apparently unaware that he'd just casually committed to spending more money than she'd see in several lifetimes on community programs. "You fund the scholarship program at the center," she said, the pieces suddenly clicking together. "Among other things," Taehyun confirmed. "Good work should be supported, Miss Chun. People who dedicate their lives to helping others shouldn't have to worry about rent money or medical bills or whether they can afford to eat." The scope of his influence was becoming clearer with every revelation. He wasn't just wealthy, he was powerful in ways that reshaped the city around him. Government officials took his calls. Police departments apparently cleared cases at his request. Permits that should take months were expedited within weeks. Money flowed from his accounts to fund programs that helped the exact people she'd devoted her life to serving. "What kind of business are you in?" she asked, though she was beginning to suspect she didn't want to know the full answer. "Import-export," Taehyun replied smoothly. "Real estate development, security consulting, investment management. I have interests in many sectors, all of which probably had legitimate fronts that masked activities she couldn't even imagine. But whatever those activities were, they generated enough power and money to eliminate an entire trafficking ring overnight and fund community programs without thinking twice about the expense." The wallet was still sitting beside her untouched. Taehyun noticed her glance and smiled slightly, the first time she'd seen genuine amusement on his controlled features. "You can move it aside if it bothers you," he said. "But I suspect you'd rather die than touch money that isn't yours." He was right, and they both knew it. Zara carefully lifted the wallet and set it on the nightstand, her fingers barely making contact with the leather. Even that brief touch felt like a compromise she wasn't comfortable with. "You're going to need to make some decisions about your future, Miss Chun," Taehyun said, his voice returning to its previous seriousness. "The trafficking ring is eliminated, but the circumstances of your rescue have created complications. People will want to know why I moved against a rival organization. Some will assume you have valuable information. Others will simply want revenge." The golden morning light streaming through the windows suddenly felt less warm. "What kind of complications?" "The kind that mean returning to your old life isn't a safe option anymore. You're part of my world now, whether either of us planned it or not. And I'm very good at protecting what's important to me." There was that possessive language again, casual and absolute. But looking at Kim Tae-hyun, seeing the controlled intensity in his dark eyes, and the way he'd orchestrated her rescue with surgical precision, Zara realized that being important to him might be the most dangerous and safest thing that had ever happened to her. Tomorrow, he'd said, they would discuss practical matters. But she was beginning to understand that practical, in his world, meant something entirely different than anything she'd ever experienced. The third evening found Zara in Taehyun's private study, a room that managed to be both intimidating and oddly comforting. Dark wood paneled the walls, lined with books in Korean, English, and what looked like Japanese. A massive desk dominated the space, its surface organized with military precision. Everything about the room suggested power held carefully in check, from the expensive leather chairs to the subtle security cameras mounted in the corners. Taehyun sat behind his desk wearing another perfectly tailored suit, this one charcoal gray with a crisp white shirt that probably cost more than her monthly grocery budget. He'd asked her to join him for what he called a practical conversation, and the formality of the setting suggested this was more than casual discussion. "You've had 2 days to process your situation," he began without preamble. "I hope you understand that your previous life in Seoul is no longer viable. The question now is what happens next." Zara shifted in the leather chair across from him, acutely aware of her borrowed clothes and the vast gulf between their circumstances. "I've been thinking about that. I could leave the country, start over somewhere else. I have some savings, enough for a plane ticket and a few months of expenses while I find work." Taehyun's expression didn't change, but something in his dark eyes suggested he'd expected exactly this response. "Where would you go, Miss Jin?" "Back to the United States where you have no job prospects and student loan debt that follows you anywhere. To another Asian country where your Korean skills won't help and you'll be starting completely from scratch. To Europe where you have no work authorization and no support network." Each possibility he outlined struck her like a physical blow because they were all true. She'd built her entire adult life in Seoul, developed language skills and cultural knowledge that were worthless anywhere else. Her savings account held maybe $8,000, enough for a few months of survival, but nowhere near enough to rebuild a life. More importantly, Taehyun continued, you would be abandoning the families who depend on your help at the community center. The Kim family with 3 children who don't speak Korean. Mrs. Park, who's been waiting 6 months for someone to help her navigate the immigration paperwork. The teenage refugees who trust only you to advocate for their educational placement. The guilt hit her immediately. She had been thinking of running, of saving herself, without considering the people who needed her. It was selfish in a way that made her stomach clench with shame. "I'm proposing an alternative arrangement," Taehyun said, leaning forward slightly. "One that allows you to continue your work while ensuring your safety and financial security." He opened a leather portfolio and removed several documents, spreading them across the desk where she could see them. The top page was a contract written in both Korean and English, dense with legal language that would take her hours to parse completely. "The position is Community Liaison Coordinator," he continued. "Your role would be to serve as the primary connection between my organization and the social service agencies throughout Seoul. When my business activities impact families or communities, you would ensure they receive appropriate support and compensation. When I need to understand the social implications of potential investments or developments, you would provide guidance." Zara stared at the contract, trying to process what he was offering. "You want to hire me to be your conscience." "I want to employ your expertise in areas where my knowledge is limited," Taehyun corrected. "You understand community needs in ways that my usual advisors do not. You have relationships with aid organizations, immigrant advocacy groups, and family service agencies that would take me years to develop independently." The compensation section of the contract made her breath catch in her throat. $150,000 annually, he said, watching her reaction. Plus full medical coverage, housing allowance, and an education fund should you choose to pursue additional certifications or degrees. Your current student loans would be paid in full within the first month of employment. $150,000. More money than she'd made in the previous 4 years combined. Enough to transform not just her life, but the lives of everyone she helped. The housing allowance alone was probably more than she currently paid in rent. But there were other terms in the contract that made her stomach tight with apprehension. Exclusive availability to his organization. absolute discretion regarding all business matters. Residence within a secured facility approved by his security team. A non-disclosure agreement that seemed to cover everything from his personal habits to his business associates. What exactly would you expect from me? She asked carefully. Loyalty, Taehyun replied immediately. Complete honesty about any conflicts of interest or ethical concerns you might have with my requests. Professional competence in managing community relationships and social programs. And absolute silence about any aspect of my operations that you might observe or learn about. The pause that followed felt heavy with unspoken implications. And if I violate those expectations, then your employment would be terminated immediately and the financial benefits would be revoked. Your student loans would become your responsibility again. The housing allowance would cease. The medical coverage would end. He didn't threaten violence or retaliation, but the message was clear enough. Cross him, and she'd find herself worse off than when she'd started, buried under debt with no resources and no safety net. More importantly, he continued, any breach of the non-disclosure agreement would put both of us in significant danger. There are people who would pay considerable money for information about my personal life, my business relationships, or my security arrangements. Protecting that information isn't just a matter of business ethics, Miss Chun. It's a matter of survival. The scope of what he was asking began to settle over her like a weight she wasn't sure she could carry. This wasn't just a job offer. It was an invitation into a world where knowledge was dangerous, where loyalty was literally a matter of life and death, where one mistake could destroy both of them. I need time to think about this, she said finally. Taehyun nodded as if he'd expected that response. You have until tomorrow evening to decide. After that, I'll need to make alternative arrangements for your safety, and those alternatives may not include remaining in Seoul. The implicit deadline felt like pressure, but she could see the logic behind it. Every day she remained in limbo was another day his enemies could plan against them. Another day the situation could destabilize in ways that put them both at risk. That night, Zara lay awake staring at the ceiling of her borrowed bedroom, weighing impossible choices against uncertain futures. The contract sat on the nightstand beside her, its legal language dense with implications she was still trying to understand. $150,000 a year. Student loans paid off. Medical coverage that would let her see doctors without calculating whether she could afford the visit. Housing in a place with heat that worked and walls that didn't let in street noise. The ability to help families without worrying about whether she could afford groceries that month. But it would mean becoming part of Kim Taehyun's world permanently. Seeing things she might not want to see. Knowing things that could get her killed. Living under protection that felt more like sophisticated imprisonment. Trading her independence for security in ways that might gradually erode who she was. She thought about the families at the community center, about Mrs. Park struggling with immigration paperwork, and the Kim children who needed someone to advocate for their education. She thought about the teenage refugees who trusted her to fight for them, and the single mothers who depended on her help accessing resources they couldn't navigate alone. If she ran, who would help them? The community center was understaffed and overwhelmed, and none of her co-workers had the language skills or cultural knowledge to serve the Korean immigrant population effectively. Without her, dozens of families would fall through cracks in the system that were already too wide. But if she stayed, she'd be accepting money that came from sources she couldn't examine too closely. She'd be taking protection from a man whose methods included eliminating entire criminal organizations overnight. She'd be trading her moral independence for financial security and physical safety. The practical part of her mind, the part that had learned to survive on ramen noodles and library internet access, pointed out that moral purity was a luxury she'd never been able to afford. The idealistic part, the part that had driven her to social work in the first place, recoiled from accepting help that came with so many ethical compromises. By morning, exhaustion had settled the debate in favor of pragmatism. She couldn't help anyone if she was dead or disappeared. She couldn't serve the community if she was hiding in another country under a false identity. And she couldn't continue her work without resources, connections, and protection that only someone like Kim Taehyun could provide. When she found him in his study the next evening, she was carrying the signed contract. "I accept your offer, Mr. Kim," she said, setting the papers on his desk with hands that shook only slightly. Taehyun looked at the signature, then at her face, his dark eyes unreadable. You understand what this means, Miss Chen. You're part of my organization now, part of my world. There's no returning to what you were before. I understand, she replied, though she suspected she was only beginning to grasp the full implications of what she'd committed herself to. He stood and extended his hand across the desk, a gesture that felt more like sealing a pact than completing a business transaction. When she shook it, his grip was firm and warm, and she realized with something approaching surprise that she wasn't afraid of him anymore. Welcome to your new life, Zara, he said, using her first name for the first time since she'd woken up in his penthouse. She had the distinct feeling that she'd just stepped off a cliff into free fall, but for the first time in years, she wasn't worried about the landing. 3 months later, Zara's life had transformed in ways she was still learning to navigate. The woman who had once counted every one before buying groceries now wore designer clothes chosen by a personal shopper who understood her preferences better than she understood them herself. The cramped studio apartment with peeling paint had been replaced by a secure penthouse unit in Taehyun's building, complete with marble countertops, a view of the Han River, and security systems that monitored every entrance and exit. But it was the work that made everything else worthwhile. As community liaison coordinator for Kim Enterprises, Zara had resources she'd never dreamed of accessing. When the Kim family needed emergency housing after their landlord doubled their rent, she'd arranged temporary accommodation in a company-owned apartment complex while securing permanent, affordable housing. When Mrs. Park's immigration paperwork had been delayed for the 6th time, one phone call from Zara's office had resulted in expedited processing and a personal apology from the immigration official handling the case. The refugee teenagers who trusted only her to advocate for their education were now enrolled in specialized programs with full scholarships, tutoring support, and college preparation courses. The single mothers who'd struggled to access basic services now had dedicated case workers and emergency assistance funds that never seemed to run dry. Everything flowed from Taehyun's resources, and she was beginning to understand the scope of his influence throughout Seoul. Government officials returned her calls immediately. Police departments took her concerns seriously. Healthcare providers offered appointment times that would normally require months of waiting. It was intoxicating and terrifying to wield that kind of power on behalf of people who'd never had anyone fight for them before. Her relationship with Taehyun had settled into routines that felt surprisingly domestic for an arrangement born of necessity and mutual benefit. He was often at the penthouse when she returned from work, having dinner prepared by his housekeeper or reading financial reports while classical music played softly from speakers hidden throughout the space. He would ask about her day with genuine interest, listening as she described the families she'd helped or the bureaucratic obstacles she'd navigated. She no longer flinched when he entered a room unexpectedly. The controlled intensity that had once felt threatening now felt protective. Like being wrapped in armor, she didn't have to carry herself. When he smiled, which happened more often now, it transformed his entire face from controlled authority to something warmer and more human. Tonight they sat in his living room after dinner, the city lights spreading below them like scattered diamonds. Taehyun had opened a bottle of wine, something French and expensive that probably cost more than her old monthly rent. The conversation had been lighter than usual, touching on current events and shared observations about Seoul's constantly changing neighborhoods. You've been distracted today, he observed, refilling her glass with precise movements. Something troubling you about the community center. Zara settled deeper into the leather sofa, wine making her more honest than she might have been otherwise. It's the 5-year anniversary, she said simply. Anniversary of what? My parents' accident. They were driving home from my college graduation when a drunk driver hit them head-on. Both killed instantly. The words came out steady, but she felt the familiar ache that always accompanied thoughts of that day. The phone call that had shattered her post-graduation celebration. The funeral arrangements she'd handled alone because she was an only child with no extended family. The sudden understanding that she was completely on her own in the world. Taehyun was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her face with an intensity that felt different than his usual careful observation. I'm sorry, he said finally. That's why you became a social worker. To help other people who were alone. Partly, she confirmed. I knew what it felt like to have no one to turn to, no support system, no safety net. I wanted to be the person I'd needed when everything fell apart. It was more personal revelation than she'd shared with anyone in years. But the wine and the comfortable silence between them had loosened defenses she usually kept carefully in place. Taehyun had shared his home, his protection, his resources. It seemed only fair to share some piece of her real self in return. "What about you?" she asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "Do you have family?" His expression shifted, walls coming up so quickly she could almost see them forming. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer, that she'd pushed too far into territory he preferred to keep private. But then he set down his wine glass and leaned back, his gaze moving to the windows and the city beyond. "I had a sister," he said quietly, "younger than me by 8 years. Her name was Minji." Had. Past tense. Zara felt her chest tighten with anticipation of pain she could hear building in his voice. "She was everything good about our family," Taehyun continued. "Sweet, kind, optimistic about the world despite growing up around my father's business. I was focused on expanding our operations, building connections, establishing the kind of power that would make us untouchable. Minji was focused on her art classes and volunteer work and the boyfriend she thought she was in love with." "The boyfriend was the problem," Zara guessed. Taehyun nodded slowly. "Park Jisoo. He seemed nice enough, polite to our parents, respectful when he visited. But he was already involved with trafficking operations, looking for a way to move up in his organization. Minji was his opportunity." The pieces were falling into place now, creating a picture that made Zara's stomach clench with dread. She'd been working with trafficking victims long enough to know how these stories usually ended. He convinced her to take a trip with him, just a weekend getaway to Busan. She was 19, thought she was in love, trusted him completely. The trip was supposed to last 3 days. When she didn't come home, we assumed they'd extended their vacation. When she didn't answer her phone for a week, I started making calls. Taehyun's hands were clenched into fists now, his controlled demeanor cracking around the edges. The wine glass sat forgotten as he lost himself in memories that clearly still had the power to destroy his composure. By the time I found her, she'd been sold to buyers in Thailand. The trafficking ring moved fast, and I was too focused on legitimate business expansion to notice the signs. Too busy with meetings and contracts and building my empire to pay attention to my little sister's new boyfriend or the way she'd started acting nervous around him. "What happened to her?" Zara asked softly, though she suspected she already knew. "She tried to escape after 2 months. They killed her for it. Made an example of her for the other women they were holding. By the time I tracked down the operation, she'd been dead for 3 weeks. The raw pain in his voice was like a physical blow. Zara understood now why he'd intervened in her own kidnapping, why he'd eliminated an entire trafficking ring without hesitation, why protecting women in danger felt like personal responsibility rather than business decision. "I built this empire to ensure no one could hurt my family again," he continued. "But I failed her when it mattered most. I was so focused on gaining power that I didn't use it to protect the one person who actually needed it." "That's why you saved me," Zara said, understanding flooding through her. It wasn't just about stopping criminals or protecting an asset. It was about getting a second chance to save someone. Taehyun's dark eyes met hers, and she saw vulnerability there that he'd never let her glimpse before. "I couldn't save Minji, but I can save you. I won't fail again." The confession hung between them, raw and honest in a way that transformed everything about their relationship. This wasn't just a business arrangement or mutual protection. This was a man trying to heal old wounds by preventing new ones, using his power to shield others from the violence that had destroyed his family. Without thinking about it, Zara reached across the space between them and covered his clenched hand with hers. His skin was warm, the calluses on his palms familiar now from months of casual contact. But this touch felt different, intentional, and comforting rather than merely polite. "You didn't fail her," she said quietly. "You were young and trying to build something meaningful. You couldn't have known what kind of man he really was." "I should have known," Taehyun replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I should have investigated him. Should have been suspicious, should have protected her better. Minji made her own choices based on information she had at the time. That's not your fault. And what you've done since then, the families you've helped through the community programs, the women you've saved by eliminating trafficking operations, that honors her memory better than guilt ever could." They sat in silence for several minutes, her hands still covering his, the weight of shared loss creating intimacy that felt different than anything they'd experienced before. Zara realized that she was seeing Kim Tae-hyun not as the controlled crime boss or protective benefactor, but as a man still grieving his little sister, still trying to make amends for perceived failures that weren't really his fault. When he finally spoke again, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "You understand, don't you? What it's like to lose family and have to rebuild everything alone." "Yes," she said simply, "but we're not alone anymore." The truth of that statement settled between them like a promise. Whatever their relationship had started as, business arrangement or mutual convenience or protection contract, it had become something else entirely. They were two people who'd lost everything and found each other, creating a new kind of family based on shared purpose and hard-won trust. When Taehyun turned his hand palm up to properly hold hers, Zara didn't pull away. The connection felt right in a way that had nothing to do with contracts or professional obligations, and everything to do with two damaged people choosing to heal together. Outside the windows, Seoul continued its restless existence, but inside the penthouse, something fundamental had shifted. They weren't just employer and employee anymore. They were partners in the truest sense, bound together by understanding that went deeper than mutual benefit. For the first time since waking up in his protection, Zara felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The warning signs started small, easy to dismiss as paranoia or coincidence. A man in a coffee shop who seemed to be watching her a little too intently. The same sedan appearing in 3 different locations during her afternoon rounds. Phone calls to the community center asking specific questions about her schedule, her routines, when she typically arrived and left. Zara mentioned it to Taehyun over dinner on a Tuesday evening, more as casual observation than genuine concern. "I think someone might be following me," she said, cutting into the perfectly prepared salmon his housekeeper had left for them. "Probably nothing, but I wanted you to know." His reaction was immediate and alarming. The controlled composure she'd grown accustomed to disappeared, replaced by something cold and predatory that reminded her exactly what kind of man she was living with. He set down his fork with precise care and leaned forward, dark eyes sharp with focus. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. So she did. The man at the coffee shop with the scar across his knuckles who'd stared too long. The black sedan that had been parked outside the community center 3 days running. The phone calls from people claiming to be journalists interested in featuring her work, asking detailed questions about her daily routine that felt more like surveillance than interview preparation. Taehyun listened without interruption, his expression growing more dangerous with each detail. When she finished, he pulled out his phone and made a call in rapid Korean, issuing what sounded like urgent instructions to someone who clearly knew better than to ask questions. "You're not going to work tomorrow," he said after ending the call, "or the day after. My security team needs time to assess the situation." "But the families I'm supposed to meet with," Zara protested. "Mrs. Park has her citizenship interview next week, and she's terrified. The Chin children need their school enrollment paperwork reviewed. Other people can handle those things temporarily," Taehyun replied, his tone suggesting the discussion was over. "Your safety takes priority over everything else." The next 2 days passed in relative isolation, Zara working from the penthouse, while security personnel she'd never seen before conducted sweeps of her usual locations. She tried to focus on administrative tasks, but the feeling of being watched, hunted, made concentration nearly impossible. On Thursday afternoon, she'd finally convinced Taehyun to let her return to the community center for a critical meeting with a family facing imminent deportation. The security escort was larger than usual, 3 men instead of the typical one, but they maintained their usual discreet distance as she entered the building. The meeting went well. The family situation was complicated but not hopeless, and Zara was able to connect them with legal aid resources that might prevent their removal from the country. She left the community center feeling productive for the first time in days, her mind already moving to the next family that needed her help. She was halfway to the car when they struck. 4 men emerged from seemingly nowhere, moving with professional coordination that spoke of military or criminal training. Her security escort reacted immediately, but they were outnumbered and caught off guard. Gunfire erupted in the parking lot, sharp cracks that sent civilians screaming and diving for cover. Zara's world narrowed to pure animal terror. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might burst. Blood ran cold through her veins as she recognized the lead attacker, the man with scarred knuckles who'd been watching her at the coffee shop. His eyes held the same dead expression she'd seen in her original kidnappers, the look of someone who viewed her as commodity rather than person. "You're coming with us," he said in accented English, grabbing her arm hard enough to leave bruises. "People want to ask you some questions about your boyfriend's business." Zara tried to run, but her legs felt like water. One of her security guards was down, blood spreading beneath him on the concrete. The other two were pinned behind parked cars, outgunned and unable to reach her. She was about to disappear again, about to become another trafficking statistic, another woman who vanished without a trace. Then the black Mercedes arrived. Taehyun emerged from the passenger seat, like violence given form, his expensive suit somehow making him look more dangerous rather than less. He moved with lethal precision, a pistol appearing in his hand so smoothly it might have materialized from thin air. The confidence in his bearing, the way he assessed and responded to the tactical situation, revealed training and experience that went far beyond legitimate business operations. The firefight that followed was brief and decisive. Taehyun's men, appearing from positions that suggested they'd been tracking the attackers for some time, moved with military efficiency. Within minutes, 3 of the 4 kidnappers were dead, and the 4th was on his knees with blood streaming from a shoulder wound. Zara found herself pressed against the side of a car, shaking so violently she could barely stand. The metallic taste of fear filled her mouth, and her vision seemed to narrow to a tunnel that included only Taehyun as he approached the wounded attacker. The conversation that followed was conducted in Korean too rapid and dialect-heavy for her to follow completely, but the tone was unmistakable. Questions asked with cold precision. Answers extracted through methods that didn't require physical torture, but somehow seemed more frightening than violence would have been. The wounded man talked, words spilling out in desperate streams as Taehyun listened with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. When it was over, the man was loaded into a van and driven away. Taehyun's cleanup crew arrived to handle the scene with efficiency that spoke of long practice. Police were called and given a story about gang violence that had nothing to do with Zara or the community center. Witnesses were spoken to and persuaded to remember events slightly differently than what had actually occurred. The ride back to the penthouse passed in silence. Taehyun sat beside her in the back seat of his armored car, still in the expensive suit, but somehow fundamentally changed by what had just happened. There was blood on his shirt cuff, barely visible against the white fabric. His hands were steady, but she could smell something metallic and sharp clinging to him, the scent of violence recently concluded. "Tell me," he said finally as they pulled into the underground garage of their building. Zara looked at him, seeing both the man who brought her breakfast and checked her injuries with gentle hands, and the man who had just orchestrated a tactical operation that left 3 people dead. The businessman who funded community programs and the crime boss who eliminated threats with surgical precision. They weren't separate people. They were the same person, and she was beginning to understand that she needed both sides of him to survive in his world. "They were going to sell me again," she said quietly. "The man with the scars, he was part of the original trafficking ring. The survivors came back for revenge." "Not survivors," Taehyun corrected, his voice carrying cold finality. "There are no survivors now. The remaining network has been completely eliminated. Every associate, every financial backer, every safe house they might have used. The problem is solved permanently." The scope of what he'd just accomplished in a matter of hours was staggering. An entire criminal organization wiped out overnight. Resources mobilized, intelligence gathered, coordinated strikes executed across multiple locations. She was looking at someone with power that reshaped the city around him when he chose to exercise it. "How many people?" she asked. "Does it matter?" he replied, the same question he'd asked months ago when she'd first learned about his intervention in her kidnapping. This time, her answer was different. "No," she said simply. "It doesn't matter." Because they were right. The men who tried to take her viewed women as livestock, who destroyed lives for profit, who would have continued operating until someone with sufficient power stopped them permanently. Moral complexity was a luxury she couldn't afford when the alternative was disappearing into a trafficking network that spanned international borders. In the elevator riding up to the penthouse, Taehyun turned to look at her directly. You understand now what my world requires, he said. What protecting you sometimes means. Zara met his dark eyes steadily. I understand that you saved my life again. I understand that without you, I'd be dead or worse. I understand that some problems can't be solved with social programs and good intentions. And I'm grateful, she said, meaning it completely. I'm grateful that you're exactly as dangerous as you need to be to keep me safe. Something shifted in his expression, relief mixing with an emotion too complex to name. When the elevator doors opened, he placed his hand on the small of her back to guide her toward their home, and she leaned into the touch instead of away from it. That night, as Zara lay in bed listening to the sound of Seoul moving restlessly below, she realized that she'd made a choice that went beyond contracts and financial arrangements. She'd chosen Kim Taehyun completely, the wealthy benefactor and the lethal crime boss, the man who funded scholarships and the man who eliminated threats with ruthless efficiency. She'd chosen to belong in his dangerous world because it was the only place she could do the work that mattered to her while being completely, absolutely safe. And for the first time since waking up in his silk sheets, she had no desire to dream of anywhere else. The aftermath of violence had a way of stripping away pretense, leaving only truth in its wake. 2 days after the parking lot confrontation, Zara found Taehyun on the penthouse balcony at 3 in the morning, still dressed in his shirt and slacks from dinner, but with his jacket discarded and sleeves rolled up. Seoul spread below them in a carpet of lights, but his attention was focused inward, on thoughts that had clearly been troubling him since the shooting. She'd been unable to sleep, mind replaying the moment when she'd realized the men were going to take her again, the bone-deep terror of understanding that all their careful security had been insufficient against determined enemies. But more than that, she kept thinking about the way Taehyun had looked when he'd emerged from that Mercedes, the cold precision with which he'd eliminated the threat, the way he'd handled the aftermath like someone who'd orchestrated similar operations countless times before. You're thinking too hard, she said softly, stepping out onto the balcony to join him. He turned at the sound of her voice, and she saw something vulnerable in his expression, walls cracked open by stress and exhaustion in ways that revealed the man beneath the controlled facade. I failed again, he said simply. They got close enough to touch you. If my intelligence network had been better, if I'd anticipated their approach differently, if I'd kept you in the penthouse until the threat was completely neutralized. You didn't fail, Zara interrupted, moving closer until she could see the fine lines of tension around his dark eyes. You saved me. Again. Your people handled the situation perfectly. My people were outmaneuvered by revenge-seeking amateurs, Taehyun replied, his voice carrying self-recrimination that surprised her with its intensity. You could have been taken. You could have disappeared, and it would have been my fault for not protecting you adequately. The guilt in his voice was raw, familiar, the same tone he'd used when talking about his sister. She realized that in his mind, every threat she faced was connected to Minji's death. Every moment of danger was another chance for him to fail someone who depended on his protection. Listen to me, she said, reaching out to touch his arm. What happened wasn't your fault. Those men made their choices. You made yours. And because of your choices, I'm here, safe, talking to you instead of chained up in some basement waiting to be sold. Taehyun's gaze dropped to where her hand rested on his forearm, dark eyes tracing the contact like it was something precious and fragile. When he looked up again, the vulnerability in his expression had shifted into something deeper, more complex. I told myself I was protecting you for Minji's sake, he said quietly. Justice for my sister, making amends for my failures, using my power to save someone I couldn't save before. But that's not true anymore. What is true? Zara asked, though her heart was already racing because she thought she knew what he was going to say. The truth is that I'm protecting you because losing you would destroy me, he said, the words coming out like a confession he'd been holding back for months. You've become the center of everything I've built. When I come home and you're here, when you tell me about the families you've helped or the children you've gotten into school programs, when you smile at something ridiculous I've said, that's when this penthouse feels like home instead of just expensive isolation. She felt tears prick her eyes at the honesty in his voice, at the way he was laying himself bare in a manner that probably terrified him more than any physical danger ever could. You make me feel human again, Taehyun continued. Before you, everything was business, strategy, power calculations. I was good at it, successful by any measure, but I was empty inside. You filled that emptiness with purpose that goes beyond revenge or empire building. You gave me something worth protecting beyond just territory and resources. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither of them had been brave enough to cross before. Zara realized that this was the moment everything changed, the point where they stopped pretending their relationship was about contracts or mutual benefit and acknowledged what it had become. I need you, he said simply. Not as an employee or a responsibility or a way to make amends for past failures. I need you because you're the only person who sees both sides of me and chooses to stay anyway. You're the only one who makes this life worth living. The intensity in his dark eyes, the way he was looking at her like she held his entire world in her hands, made her breath catch in her throat. She'd fallen in love with him gradually, so slowly that she'd barely noticed it happening until the feeling was too strong to deny. But hearing him say that he needed her, that she'd become essential to his existence, gave her the courage to voice what she'd been feeling for weeks. I love you, she said, the words coming out steady and clear. Not just grateful for your protection or appreciative of your resources. I love you. The man who brings me breakfast when I'm sick and the man who eliminates threats with surgical precision. The businessman who funds community programs and the crime boss who reshapes Seoul when necessary. All of you. Something fundamental shifted in Taehyun's expression, relief and desire and possessive satisfaction combining into an intensity that made her stomach flutter with anticipation. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne and see the faint scar along his temple that spoke of violence survived. You're mine, he said, the words carrying absolute certainty. Not because of contracts or arrangements or protection agreements. You're mine because you choose to be, because you see what I am and want it anyway. Because you love both sides of me completely. I'm yours, Zara agreed, reaching up to touch his face, fingertips tracing the sharp line of his jaw. And you're mine. All the wealth and power and dangerous competence. The gentleness and the violence. The businessman and the crime boss. Mine. The words seemed to unlock something in him. Taehyun pulled her against him with careful intensity, one hand tangling in her natural hair while the other settled at the small of her back. When he kissed her, it was with months of restrained desire finally given permission, possessive and claiming and desperately tender all at once. She kissed him back with equal fervor, pouring all her love and gratitude and acceptance into the connection between them. This was what she'd been missing without realizing it. The feeling of belonging completely to someone who would move heaven and earth to keep her safe. When they finally broke apart, breathing hard and hearts racing, Taehyun rested his forehead against hers, dark eyes searching her face with something like wonder. Marry me, he said, the proposal coming out like a statement of fact rather than a question. Not for protection or convenience or business arrangements. Marry me because I love you and can't imagine my life without you in it. Yes, Zara replied without hesitation, the answer feeling as inevitable as sunrise. Forever yes. The smile that transformed his face was brilliant and rare, more genuine happiness than she'd ever seen him express. He kissed her again, softer this time, but no less possessive, sealing the promise between them with physical connection that felt like coming home. I want to expand the legitimate businesses, he said against her lips, already planning their future together. More community programs, scholarship funds, legal aid services. Build something meaningful that helps the families you care about while providing cover for the other operations. Our children will inherit an empire that does more good than harm. Our children, she repeated, the phrase sending warmth through her entire body. A future where their love created something beautiful and lasting, where his power served purposes beyond mere survival and territory control. They'll never know poverty or fear or helplessness, Taehyun promised, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone accustomed to reshaping reality through force of will. They'll grow up safe and loved and educated, with parents who understand both the light and dark sides of the world they'll inherit. Standing on the balcony overlooking Seoul, wrapped in the arms of a man who commanded both legitimate business operations and criminal enterprises, Planning a future that combined love with power and purpose with protection, Zara realized that reality had exceeded any dream she could have imagined. 6 months ago, she'd been a struggling social worker counting every one, working herself to exhaustion for people who would never be able to repay her kindness. Now she was engaged to a man who could provide resources beyond her wildest dreams while loving her with an intensity that made her feel precious and irreplaceable. When they finally went inside, Taehyun's arms still around her as they moved through the penthouse that had become their home, Zara thought about that first morning when she'd awakened in silk sheets thinking everything had to be a dream. The disorientation and fear, the overwhelming luxury, the dangerous stranger who'd saved her life and changed everything about her existence. She'd been wrong about it being a dream. This was real, permanent, chosen rather than imposed. And it was better than anything her imagination could have created. The next morning, she woke to sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows and Taehyun's arms around her, his breathing deep and even against her hair. The engagement ring he'd produced from somewhere in his impossibly organized life caught the light. Diamonds that probably cost more than most people's houses, but somehow felt exactly right on her finger. This wasn't a dream anymore. This was her life, chosen and claimed and fiercely protected. And as she settled deeper into his embrace, listening to his heartbeat and the distant sounds of Seoul beginning another day, Zara Chun had never felt more awake or more completely alive. She was home.